Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton, aka Possibilityman. We're committed to bringing you guests who strive to better people's lives and serve as a force for good in the world. Our guest today is Dr. Larry Dale Young. He shares the balanced life with his clients. He helps them make sense of things, make better decisions, and behave wisely. His coaching strategy is designed to support individuals in achieving the balanced life. He draws principles from the Book of Proverbs, which leads us to discover the wisdom within. Dr. Young, welcome to the show today.
Good afternoon.
Look, I'm looking forward to our conversation, but first, this reminder to our viewers and our listeners. Follow, like, and share this podcast wherever you find it. Well, Dale, I know that you are a coach and a blogger on the World Wide Web today, but what was your career before doing what you do now?
Well, Stephen, I'll give you the 2-minute version. A pretty standard career path. Went to college for 4 years, then got a master's degree, then out working in industry for 12 years. That got me to mid to late 30s, decided it was time for a career change. So we packed up, went back to graduate school, and I got a PhD and made a 180-degree swap in career direction and spent the next 30 years in higher education as a faculty member and then as an administrator. So I retired about 2 years ago, and my mentor said, don't retire, repurpose. And that's what I've done with my blog and the time I spent on LinkedIn. So here I am.
Yeah, I got you. So what was your career like as an academic? How would you describe it? What was it like for you? I think you did more than teaching. You were also an administrator. So just share with us what it was like for you.
I was at 2 different universities, Miami University in Ohio, and then Georgia College, which is Georgia's liberal arts university in Milledgeville. I spent the last 15 years of my career there at Georgia College, taught for the first couple of years, and then for the last half of my career, really, in academia, I was an administrator. I was an associate dean, and then for the last few years of my career, I was the dean of the College of Business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, outsiders, when they look at academics, they'd like to think that academics don't work hard. What is your take on that as someone who was a faculty member, an associate dean, and also a dean?
Well, I can't speak for everyone, but for me, I thought I worked pretty doggone hard. I got tenured both at Miami U and at Georgia College, and so that's quite a process to get through all those hurdles. But my time as administrator was pretty demanding. When I was associate dean, I was responsible for all the internal operations for the college. So I was normally in my office about 7, and I was doing good to be out of there by 6.
I understand.
Long days.
And getting tenure at Miami University surely was not an easy feat, was it?
I don't know the percentages there, but we really enjoyed the 12 years we spent there. It was in Oxford, Ohio, small college town, beautiful location, great university, incredible students, and I enjoyed the time that I had there very much.
Fantastic. And now you made this shift to social media, becoming a media personality. So are you enjoying yourself doing what you do now?
I really see this as an issue of life purpose here at this particular stage of my life. I was, I think, pretty deliberate about making the change approximately 2 years out from retirement, I started the process of thinking through, I'll need a blog. I mean, somebody's going to have to set it up for me, find someone to do that work. Started doing some initial writing, eventually changed what I was doing on LinkedIn, because prior to that, for years, I had been on LinkedIn, but I was the associate dean or the dean of the College of Business, and I was pushing the College of Business, and everything I said was about the business and the College of Business and our students, and look what we're doing. And then as soon as I retired, I made that switch very quickly to the writing that I'm doing now. This, like you said, based in the Book of Proverbs.
Right. So, and I find that interesting. So why does the Book of Proverbs, and a lot of great books in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, why does the Book of Proverbs appeal to you as it does?
I started this process in 2016. I was looking for something that would fit into the other professional development work that I was doing. I was doing quite a bit of professional development, reading books, doing webinars, well, the whole list of things you would expect.
Yeah.
And I said, there must be some connection between scripture and professional development. And I settled in on the Book of Proverbs. And what I was most focused on was trying to understand those fundamental precepts that are there. And can I take them back into the office and plug them in? And obviously you can, it's just very practical information. And so that's what drove me to the Book of Proverbs. Now, originally I wasn't, back in 2016, I wasn't planning on blogging at that point. It was just, this is for me. And so I started writing notes in my Bible. Well, after a while, you run out of room to write in your Bible, even with a wide margin Bible. So I got a journal and I started journaling. And over a period of years, you create a lot of journal pages. I hit page 500 and I said, something's got to give here. And so that's when I said, what, I really need to start giving some of this content away. And that got me into the blogging.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about this. And when you talked about Proverbs, you described yourself as a person of faith. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So let me ask you my question. Does a person, in order to benefit from Proverbs, let me backtrack some, does a person have to be one of faith to get the life benefits, to get the juices, the wisdom, from Proverbs?
Well, the short answer is no, you don't have to be, because if you look at the Book of Proverbs and you pull out the references to reverence and to lordship, then what are you left with? You're left with the same wisdom literature that's been around for thousands of years, that have been written about in by any number of different people and different cultures over different times. Solomon is just happened to be somebody that recorded some of what his learnings were, so that the content is not unique. It is not special. What is unique about Proverbs is that combination of the wisdom literature and the life of faith. I think that's what sets it apart.
I see. Okay, so I want to look at Proverbs globally first, as big picture as we can, and then I want to get into the nuts and bolts. Is it okay with you?
That's fine.
So when you consider Proverbs then globally, what are some of its teachings, broadly speaking? Maybe two or three of them.
Okay, so one of the most fundamental things he teaches is you've got to be teachable. You got to be willing to listen and to learn. And so in the opening chapters, he's repeatedly saying, listen to me, hear what I've got to say, pay attention to this. This is important. It's a parent to child conversation, but you have to be really careful because the content isn't for a little child. The content is adult stuff. And when you get into later chapters, you figure that out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So one of the main takeaways is you've got to be teachable. And then the other thing is you got to be really turned on to where to find good advice. He used the term wise counsel because he says, there's all kinds of counsel out there in the world, and you need the discernment to know the difference between good counsel and wise counsel and to understand these fundamental precepts. So that's a couple of things just right off the top of my head. And I didn't use, a third one would be to get down to where he starts defining what wisdom is. And he's really careful to say that wisdom isn't native intelligence and it's not common sense. Instead, it's this ability to grasp these fundamental precepts like I just rattled off and take them out and plug them in and use them.
Yeah, I mean, discernment, you mentioned your second point, that's a powerful word. And so it's like there are many voices, but discernment allows you to do what? Focus on one or to do what?
It certainly helps you know that what I'm hearing is really worth repeating and applying to my own life. If you get all the way back into chapter 23, the opening verses of that chapter talk about how important it is when you're in front of somebody that's in power, that's a leader, that's influential, that you're really careful to be discerning about what they're saying and to understand their motives. So that's really where discernment takes you is, okay, I'm understanding what this person's saying, but what are their motives here? Why are they telling me this? And he says, if you don't get that, you're going to make some really bad choices.
Right. I love that word, discernment. So now Solomon, do you like him? When you read him, do you get the impression, I like this character from the Bible?
If you go back and read his biography in the Book of Kings and in Chronicles, he just kind of appears. He's one of David's kids, and you don't hear much about him. And then he wasn't the oldest son, so wasn't first one in line to be king. And his mom, went back to David and said, "You promised me he was going to be king, and so you're going to make this happen." And so those opening chapters, particularly of First Kings, there's a lot of some pretty heavy duty pushing and shoving. So, he comes across as very wise and patient and knowledgeable, but he could be pretty ruthless when he needed to be to make things happen. So there's a mix there. Yeah. So I like the guy. I enjoy his teaching, but maybe you better watch out.
Okay. So what do you know about his relationship with his father?
He doesn't say a whole lot about that. There's some in the later chapters when David was dying, David spent some time talking to him and gave him some reminders. And David said, "Here's a list of people, and you better be careful about this guy." And so it was just, kind of going down through his do, don't do list, but he was saying, "You better watch out for some of these people. And I hope you get even with this guy." So other than that, we don't know a lot. But when you get back into the Proverbs, he says, "I'm teaching this to my children because my mom and dad taught this to me." And so he basically is repeating some of what he heard.
Right.
From
Okay.
his dad.
So I got you. Okay. So, you speak a lot about, this is Proverbs is what you draw from. And in your teaching and sharing, I should say, you share a lot about purpose and discovering your purpose. So firstly, let's talk about you, if you don't mind sharing. How did you discover your purpose now? And then how did Solomon in Proverbs help you to do that?
It's hard for me to answer a purpose question without connecting that to God's guidance and God's working in my life.
Okay.
I know that's contradicting what I told you a couple of minutes ago, but when I get down to the issue of purpose, for me, it's more than just what am I good at? It's more than what do I have to give away? It's more than, gee, this is really valuable and I want to share this. To me, it's really an issue of what is the Lord leading me to do and what can I give back that's unique and different based on what I've learned from Scripture. And so for me, purpose is really tied to my personal faith.
Yeah.
I get it that that's not an issue for a lot of people, that their personal faith is just off to the side. Okay, that's fine. I get it. You can have life purpose and not be a person of faith at all.
Mhm.
That's okay, but that's just not the way it works for me. Now, the second part of your question was, how did you see that in Proverbs? And at the end of chapter 2, Solomon uses a word, a Hebrew word, that God used in his conversation with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. And basically, my take on the word is that he's saying you need to get on with what you know to be your life's purpose. Carry out what you know you're supposed to be doing. And so Solomon's view is, at the end of chapter 2, that you can understand that and you can pursue that wholeheartedly. Just like when God talked to Abraham and said, you know what? You're 99 years old. It's time for you to get on with your life.
Yeah.
No, that was Abraham's, that chapter is Abraham's midlife crisis. If you want to read a midlife crisis chapter, go to Genesis 17.
Sure.
So then later in chapter 4, Solomon talks about life purpose, or what you've been prepared for, as it's a light. And that light just keeps getting brighter and brighter, and you understand more and more about it the closer you get to it. And so those are two word pictures that he gives. One, recognizing life purpose, and the other one, moving toward this light that you're seeing that's guiding you. And that's what you know, that's your why.
Mm-hmm.
So why and purpose for me are interchangeable English words.
Understood. Yeah, Solomon's father knew a great deal, no doubt, about adversity. Did Solomon have the same, not the same, but would you say that Solomon understood from life experience about adversity, and especially about an individual's opportunity to choose again?
He probably saw his dad make a lot of mistakes. The family life of David was really messy. And Solomon grew up watching all that stuff go on. I mean, one of his brothers tried to take over the kingdom. So he saw a lot of messiness, but by the time he got to be king, things had calmed down quite a bit. And so he really enjoyed the result of what his dad had done about establishing the nation and providing peace. Now, that said, he really picked up the ball and ran with it. And that was a time of incredible wealth creation, incredible influence and power for that nation, because of people respected him. At one point, when he was looking for building materials for the temple, he was talking to another king, and that king said, I know your dad, and I trust you because of what I know from your dad, and your dad has a son who's wise and discerning, and so I'll provide you whatever you need. Yeah, he, early on, within the first few weeks of his becoming king, there were some challenges, but mostly it was things went well and people respected him, and he just accumulated wealth for himself and for the nation.
Uh-huh. Do you think he saw purpose as something that required an individual to unleash his brute force? Or did he see a person being on purpose as something else? How would he see that? If you get my question, is it power and force, or is it something else?
I'm going to have to answer yes on this one. I think he saw both sides of that equation. There's a verse at one point in Proverbs that talks about people that are strong, meaning strong-willed and determined, and those are the people that manage to retain wealth. And so he talked about digging in your heels and being determined and persistent. And he talks about the spider getting into the king's castle and all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So you see that side of him and that determination and that just raw persistence.
Yeah.
But the other side was his ability to recognize wise counsel. And he's repeatedly through the book, he's saying you need to, good leaders pay attention. They know good counsel when they hear it, and they pull in people around them that are telling them the truth. He says poor leaders listen to liars. You wound up being surrounded by liars. So I don't know that I could say that there's a nice middle point for this. It's a tough question.
Yeah,
Really, it's probably both. You need to be stern. He will give verses like, a good leader has this stern appearance and it causes bad advisors to run away. I mean, so some of it was your this aura about you with this leadership that just oozes out of you. He talks about that and its strength, but he also talks about that sensitive side. And when you get into the last chapter, chapter 31, it's a conversation that most writers say it's probably him talking or his mom talking to him. And his mother warned him. She says, don't waste your time on, and this is a terrible paraphrase, but basically wine, women, and songs. Just don't piddle your life away doing stuff that doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So he picked up both sides of that question you're asking.
Got it. So when you think about Solomon, and of course now you've already established that you consider him to have been a wise man, what are maybe one or two illustrations, best illustrations, as you see it, of his wisdom?
Well, certainly the content of the book itself is just extremely practical. One simple example, he talks about the lot, I mean, basically drawing straws. And so from that, we get that the simplest answer sometimes is the best answer. So even at the lowest level, he can get down to some really sensible, usable teaching. He talks quite a bit of using mental models like sowing and reaping, and you see that scattered throughout the book. He'll talk about if you sow humility, you'll reap God's grace in your life. So there's some examples of his stated wisdom. But if I go back to the earlier example of when they were building the temple, that was a massive multi-year project that involved thousands and thousands of workers and incredible amounts of raw materials. And one of the descriptors back in those historic chapters talks about cutting down trees in Lebanon, hauling them out to the sea, moving 100 miles or so south and pulling them back off those. But I mean, it was a pretty involved process. And so you gotta be a wise person to make all that work. His dad did accumulate some of that stuff, but Solomon's the one that designed it and made that temple what it was.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm persuaded then from you that Solomon was a wise man. I'm still curious about how did he handle, subjects like forgiveness and compassion. He's just espousing all of this wisdom. Some people are not going to get it. How did Solomon handle forgiveness and compassion?
I want to start on the harsh side first.
Okay.
There's a verse that talks about dealing with backbiting and difficult people, and he uses a phrase, something along the lines of a harsh countenance and a stern response. So part of him was, if someone is bullying you, being difficult, don't be a doormat, You need to stand up and you need to get in their face and you need to say, this isn't going to work. And so there's that tough leadership side. But there are a number of other situations where he talks about getting the facts, being willing to listen, and not jumping on the first thing that you hear. So he talks about being careful about, well, he says, the first person in that has a story, well, that sounds really good. He says, you better be careful to get the other side of the story first. And he talks about if you've got an issue with your neighbor, don't go public and complain because you may be making a fool of yourself. He says, go to that person one-on-one and have that conversation with them. And I know that's not directly addressing the issue of forgiveness, but he was always looking to make sure he understood the situation completely before he made comments and before he responded. Now, he's like the rest of us. He wasn't perfect and he made mistakes. But if you go back to, say, 1 Kings chapter 3, that's a long conversation between Solomon and God about, and that's basically where he asked God to give him wisdom. He said, give me a discerning heart so I can lead this people. Everybody knows the first half of that chapter if you've done any reading at all. But the last half of that chapter is the story of those two women that came in. One dead child, one living child, and the women were arguing about who the living child belonged to. Remember, this split the baby. I mean, that's where we get that phrase, split the baby. Where he says, okay, we'll just cut the baby in half. And the real mom said, oh no, don't do that. He could be pretty stern. And in that case, he forced a decision. He forced an emotional response from someone right there on the spot. And that's really the core of that whole conversation. There was nobody else that could vouch for these two women. Their occupations meant that they weren't, of great moral character to begin with. How am I going to get to the root of this? And the root was force an emotional response.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a story that's renowned worldwide. But look, you mentioned that Solomon, you said he was not perfect. He made some mistakes. Can you think of any examples of one mistake that he made?
Well, late in his lifetime, he accumulated lots of wealth. He also accumulated lots of wives. And some of those wives weren't worshipers of Yahweh. They worshiped idols. And it is what it is. You accumulate wives at that time as a king, I suppose, because it was a way to do alliances. And there's a single, short phrase late in his life where it says they turned his heart away from God. And then if you want a longer version of that, you look at the book of Ephesians. He's pretty sarcastic in there at times. I mean, this is an old guy looking back on life. Now, at the very end of the book, he says, okay, so how does all this play out? What's really essential is to trust God and to live a good life. So he did say, when he got to chapter 12, here's the foundation.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of sarcasm in Ecclesiastes where he says, I've been wealthy, and what did I decide? It means nothing.
Yeah. I see. Look, you've blogged about, subjects as you draw from Solomon, including the engaged life. What do you mean when you reference the engaged life, and what's its connection to Proverbs?
If you take the first 9 chapters of Proverbs as a block, basically that's where he introduces this concept of wisdom, concept of being teachable, all those fundamentals, those fundamental teachings. And so repeatedly in those chapters, he says, I want you to give me your heart, meaning your character, that deepest inner nature of yourself. He says, I want you to make that deep inner nature the focus of your personal change and of your personal growth. So the basic growth model in Proverbs is you change who you are inside by changing your character, changing your heart. And what comes out of that is a change in what you do. There's the model. If you want to change the outcomes in your life, change yourself. Take responsibility for yourself. Now, where do we see that play out in the wisdom literature? Well, you pick up a book like The 7 Habits. What does Covey talk about in regard to the very first habit? He talks about being proactive, about taking responsibility for outcomes in your life. Well, here's Solomon, 3,000 years prior, saying, take responsibility for your own life. So there's that fundamental model. Change who you are inside. Get your integrity right. Be a person who's honest in their business dealings and dependable, and all those good characteristics that we would rattle off. He said, if you take that inside, if that's the foundation for who you become, then you're going to change the decisions you make. And as a result of making better decisions, you're going to behave better. So there's the fundamental, simple model of the Book of Proverbs right there.
Yeah, and that connects me then, because maybe you've already said it, but I want to include this word into it, because you've blogged about personal transformation. Is that what you were just talking about? That is possible? Yeah.
And so if you go back to the opening verses of chapter 1, he gives us a goal. He says, your goal should be to know wisdom. And then when you get back to the book of Ecclesiastes, he said, I dedicated my life to knowing wisdom. Now, obviously, he wasn't talking about getting smarter, because you're not going to you're not going to raise your IQ. Okay. So he's talking about building character and learning these fundamental precepts and then making decisions based on those precepts. So now there's your goal in chapter 1, know wisdom. And then he starts talking about, well, what does that look like? Well, one thing it looks like is that you behave wisely. I mean, that's one of the very first words he uses is a Hebrew word that talks about behaving wisely. How do I behave wisely? You just keep churning your way down through those opening verses of chapter 1. You want to behave wisely? Make better decisions. Use good judgment. Well, okay, well, how can I make better decisions? Well, then you need to be able to think on your feet and think deeply. You got to be able to change the way you think. Okay, well, how do I do it? Okay, well, I need to get wise counsel and I need to be discerning. I mean, there's when you read back through that, and you'll think, this guy's not telling me anything I haven't heard my entire life. Everybody knows that. Yeah. But we don't do it very well. There's your foundation right there. Build discernment, be willing to take wise counsel so that you can think critically. That critical thinking drives good judgment. Good judgment drives wise behavior. Right. That model's been around forever. Everybody's heard it. Everybody knows it. Go do it.
Well, it sounds like common sense, but at the same time, they also sound like a lot of rules, a lot of, you do this, and, so I want to hear you talk about how this jives with what your phrase, how a person come up with the authentic self. How, with all of these things, all of these precepts, how can you become this authentic person that you also write about?
If you look at, just take scripture as an example, and look at the people that show up as some of the major characters. They have all kinds of personality differences. So authentic self doesn't mean that you're the same as everybody else. Moses, for instance, was pretty temperamental. I mean, he killed somebody one time. He got angry and killed an Egyptian. And he wound up spending 40 years in the desert as a shepherd because of that. David was very impetuous. He made some really poor choices, just off the top of his head. I'm going to go do this. And, and on and on. You can read if you think back through those examples. So authentic self doesn't mean that we're all the same. It does mean that you have clarity, though, about who you are as a person. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And so he really pushes us hard to begin with who. So those opening chapters, particularly the first 9 chapters, it's all about, do you understand who you are? It's about this character transformation. It's about your heart, about who you are inside. Do you understand who that person is? And he talks about being reflective, particularly in chapter 14. He says, a discerning person is going to spend time in personal reflection. That's how you get to that point of knowing who you are. He pushes really hard on things we already mentioned, the honesty and persistence and so forth. Those signs of integrity. But all of that means that I'm still a person. I'm still who I am. So for me, I'm still an introvert. I'm not going to be this wonderful, Solomon's father was a musician and a poet. Okay, well, that's not me. I get that. I'm different from that. I tend to be pretty analytical and factual. And I know that's not going to carry me as far as I need to go. So understand your true self, but also recognize what can I change? What can I backfill? Where can I make something else work so that my life can have an impact on people around me? So there's that issue of transformation.
Okay. Now, with all that we've talked about, Dale, purpose, engaged life, the authentic self, transfer, all of that, how do we achieve then the core of what you share, which, as I understand it, is the balanced life? So what is this balanced life and how do we get there?
He spends quite a bit of time in chapter 3 pushing this issue of balance. And if you go, let's back up a second to his definition of wisdom in chapter 2, verse 6. He talks about having a being, meaning I understand my relationship with the Lord. There's that fundamental relationship in life. And then he talks about knowing, factual knowledge, and he talks about what can you do with that factual knowledge. And so that's the first place where he introduces this concept of wisdom. He says, it's nice to know a whole bunch of stuff, but if you can't do anything with it, if you can't practically apply it, you don't have any way of using it, he says you're not going to be worth much as an individual. So the very foundation of balance is knowing and doing, and be able to get those two right. And so there has to be listening and learning, but there's also got to be doing. If if you're on LinkedIn or any other social media site, you've been inundated for the last week with what are your goals, what are your, on and on it goes. And it's nice, but invariably they'll tell you it's nice to have all these plans, but if you're not taking action on them, plans are a waste of time. So then that drives us to chapter 3. And he starts talking about balance in terms of knowing the law and then knowing the precepts. So if you think of the law as the thou shalt nots, I know what scripture requires of me. The precepts are what you get out of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. How do you practically apply this? And the best word picture for that is back in chapter 6, where he says the law is the light and the precepts are the lamp. So the lamp is this device that lets me carry the law around, the light around with me. It's like a candle that you carry around, and if that candle's with me, I have light. So the light is the law, and the precepts for the candle or the lamp that's creating that light. I need both. I need to have that practical application. If I can't keep that in balance, then, well, one easy place to see out of balance lies is to look at the conversations Christ had with the Pharisees. The Pharisees knew the law, not a problem. I mean, they knew it all, but they struggled with practical application, hence the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, it's not enough to know what the law says about being a neighbor. If you don't stop and help someone, you're not living out that part of the law. So Solomon talks about the law and the precepts there in chapter 3, and then he repeats using the phrase mercy and truth, where mercy would be the precepts. Does the law, does what I know, what these requirements are, does it change the way I act? It doesn't change the way I act and who I am. What good is it? So there's that issue of balance, and you can think of balance and any number of other issues. I've talked about learning and doing. I mean, but you can be out of balance in any number of areas of your life if you're not careful. So that's where he pushes us to say, you can learn a whole bunch of stuff and still be useless. You can have lots of experiences and not be of any value at all. But you gotta be practical and useful.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that Solomon was an early teacher of personal and professional development?
Yeah, and I've been doing it the flip side of that. I mentioned a few minutes ago about Covey and the proactive life. What I see in the personal development literature matches very well with some of these precepts that Solomon mentioned. So if you get to the end of Proverbs chapter 4, he talks about being focused and understanding your goal and keeping your eyes straight ahead, not getting out of focus. And there's that idea, I know my goal, so I'm beginning with the end in mind. I know that the end point, and I'm making first things first. I've got priorities. I mean, it's pretty easy to define that stuff when you're reading through the Book of Proverbs. Oh yeah, here's how that's worded in this book over here.
Yeah. So Solomon, from your standpoint, expected human beings to grow and evolve in wisdom and knowledge and the like.
Yeah, that's one of the earliest versions of you need to be very intentional about personal growth. If you're not, and he says, if you're unteachable, and he's just pretty strong language, you're a fool. If nobody can tell you anything, he says, you're being foolish.
Yeah.
And your life is going to be a mess.
Yeah. You and others have talked about a value proposition. And would you consider, because this is your phrase, value proposition, would you consider that in connection with Solomon and share with us what you mean by that, this value proposition? That is, do you look at, let me let you speak to that.
Okay, I guess the one starting point would be to define a value proposition as a short statement. And so a value proposition basically says what you do. So I'm Dale Young and I share the balanced life. So there's what I do. And then you have to tell your target audience. And I use the phrase influencers because a lot of people that follow me are coaches or they're professionals. They fit that category of an influencer. So what do you provide? Who's your target? And what are the benefits that you return back to those people? So I talk about benefits like being wise-hearted and wise behaving, and we've already discussed those briefly. So there's there's a one sentence, and basically when you talk about it, what is my value proposition?
Yeah.
You should be able to write one sentence very clearly that says, here's what I do, and here are the outcomes.
Yeah.
So now, when you get into Proverbs and look at a value proposition, let's just take the first half of that phrase, value. He talks a lot about values. What do you value above all else? So in chapters 2 and chapter 3, for instance, he talked about you should value these precepts above all material things. It doesn't matter about gold and silver, or precious jewels, any of that stuff. He says, you need to make sure that your values are tied on correctly. It's not about wealth. It's not about how much you have and what can you get. But he doesn't use a value proposition, but he does talk about values. And he talks about what wisdom returns to us. And so if you look at, again, if you stay in those opening chapters, what happens if I'm living a precept-driven life? If I'm grasping these fundamental precepts, what am I getting back out of that? And he rattles off a list of things like discernment and deep thinking, ability to think critically, the ability to exercise discretion in personal relationships and make good choices. He gives lots of negative examples of here's what happens if you're simple-minded and you make these bad choices. Your life is a mess. And let me tell you what it looks like. And so he gives you the negative examples. So lots of value added to being precept-driven and getting down to the point where you can say, yes, I know wisdom, and here's how it's impacted my life.
I see. Okay. I have a few more things, several more things, but I can't ask all of them today. But the two things that I don't want to overlook, I think they are linked together. One is about self-care. I'll just tell you now. When I saw that, I wondered how does self-care connect to Proverbs in the Solomon. But then recently, I saw you wrote about, and I'm quoting you now, and you asked the question, can I overdo self-worth? And I thought, whoa, that's a profound question, especially as we start 2023, And so are those two things linked? And answer that question for us. Can we overdo self-worth? Self-care, the importance of that, are you drawing that from Solomon? And then finally, and I think they're linked, can we overdo this thing called self-worth?
For me, it's easy to draw a continuum and draw points on the end of the continuum and say, where am I? And so in the balanced life, you try to stay somewhere there in the middle of whatever continuum you're discussing, working hard to earn money versus enjoying the fruits of your labor. And so, that's a classic argument that Solomon makes in Ecclesiastes. What good is it to work all your life if you don't get to enjoy it?
Yeah.
So one continuum that you can draw for balance is to put self-worth out on one end of it. And you get out of balance with self-worth to the point that you're really arrogant and you're not listening anymore and you know it all. And this is that unteachable fool that Solomon talks about. So can you push self-worth off of that midpoint till it gets really extreme? And so that's what I was trying to write about in that post was I can go off the end. If you put self-care on a continuum, if I push it too far, can I get off at the other extreme where I'm doing nothing productive, but my whole life is just self-care and it's self-consumed, and then you become that sluggard or the lazy person that Solomon warns. So anyway,
Yeah.
The people that took issue with what I was saying in that were concerned that I was maybe belittling this concept of self-worth a bit. And I wasn't belittling. It's really important to have a clear sense of self, to know who you are, to value that person, to be confident about who that person is. Okay, I'm not, those are some fundamental precepts, but you have to be really careful that at some point, self-confidence stops wherever you're on this continuum. You're going to move past being self-confident and you're going to start becoming arrogant, and then you got problems.
Yeah.
And so that was the point I was trying to make.
I see. I understand that. Well, I mean, sometimes though, when people have a lot, it's easy to go to arrogance. Solomon had a lot, wisdom, possessions. Did he at any point seem to become a bit arrogant?
I don't know that I would say arrogant. If you look back in Ecclesiastes, he certainly talked about the emptiness of life. He said, look at all the stuff that I did, all the stuff I built. And then he says, well, what did it all amount to? And he said, well, nothing really. Yeah. And so you can get a little jaded if you don't maintain that humility and that close reverence that keeps you grounded and keeps you from becoming overly self-confident. Again, you get out of balance. So you got to watch yourself. You got to watch yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, look, I do have one more that I just got it because you listed in various places some precepts from Proverbs. I have 12 that you've listed. I'm not going to ask you to talk about all of them, but the ones that I recorded included judgment. You've already talked about that. Critical thinking. You've talked about that. Discernment. You've talked about that. Of the others, like reverence, insight, self-awareness, self-control, what would you say is your favorite or most important of Solomon's precepts that you share with people? If you want to mention two, that's fine.
I don't know that I've got one single favorite. I see them kind of as this grouping, and you need to really be able to do a variety of things to function well in life. If I got pushed really hard,
I'm pushing hard.
I probably would go back to chapter 18, verse 1, where he talks about having this goal in life. What is it that you really want to accomplish? And he talks in other places about desire alone isn't good enough. It's not enough to just say, I really want to do this. Big deal. Lots of people really want to do stuff. So he says in chapter 18, verse 1, he says, you've got this deep desire, and so you recognize that deep desire is going to cause you to have to set aside or say no to some other things. And that's really a big issue in life, is the ability to say, if I'm going to accomplish this goal, I'm going to wind up saying no to other stuff so I can say yes to this bigger piece. Yeah. And so I set aside some things, and I'm focused on this goal accomplishment, and then I spend my time. That becomes the focus of my life.
Right.
Can that be problematic if you have a single focus? Well, sure it can. It can be destructive. So
I got you. I got to follow up on that one, but just for the sake of time, I want to ask my follow-up. I'll have to talk with you again about another time about this. But I do want to ask you, though, before we say goodbye to each other, do you consider the last chapter in Proverbs a conclusion or a summary, synopsis of the whole? And if so, what is his last points to us?
Uh, I view Proverbs is three different collections that are chopped up into the chapters. So there's that first collection I already talked about, chapters 1 through 9.
Mm.
And then you got chapters 10 through 24. That's really the guts of the book, where you get most of the precepts and the little couplets and comparisons and so forth.
Mm.
Chapters 25 to 29 are materials that were copied about 300 years later. There's some duplication in those chapters with what had appeared earlier, but those were copied out. So there's the three big chunks of the book. So chapters 30 and 31 are one chapter appendices. Chapter 30, it gives the name of the person. We don't know a lot about the guy, but the format and the comparisons are very similar to Proverbs. So there's wisdom from someone who was a contemporary of Solomon, and that wisdom got pulled into the book of Proverbs, but Solomon wasn't the writer of that. And then chapter 31 is the same way. It's not a summary of the book. Instead, it's some comments from his mother about the value of a wife. And so most of chapter 31, the last half of that chapter, talks about the value of having a good wife. Now, Solomon's version of that, I think, is in 1822, where he says, whoever finds a wife finds something good.
Yeah.
I've searched, but I can't find a comparative verse that says if you find a husband, you find something good. So I have to let that one go.
Yeah, I got you.
So anyway, the short answer to your question is no, the last chapter isn't a summary of the book. I don't know that there's any one summary unless the easiest way to get the summary would be to read the opening chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. And that's where you get an idea of his summary of what life was like as a wise person. And then the best closer is in Ecclesiastes 12, where he says, no, here's the total of all of this. Here's what really matters.
Yeah.
And he talks about a life of faith and doing the right thing. So that's what life is all about to him.
Sounds good, Dale. I tell you what, I've enjoyed our conversation. And I can say without hesitation that talk with you has renewed my appreciation for Solomon and the book of Proverbs. I'm going to go back to that book and spend some time with it because of this conversation. So thank you.
That's great.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Appreciate the questions.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you've been listening to the Possibility Action Network podcast. Our guest today has been Dr. Larry Dale Young. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton. Until next time, good day.
You are not alone, just keep